C-SPAN is a non-profit cooperative of the cable television industry, providing unedited, gavel-to-gavel coverage of public events without commentary or analysis.
Up next on C-SPAN, the implications of the West Bank uprising are discussed during this panel discussion from the annual conference of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee.
To start with, my name is Joseph Najjar. I will be moderating this afternoon panel here. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm leading the chapter ADC in Phoenix. Before I start, I have a couple of announcements to make. I'd like to all of you to know that all the panels of this convention are being videotaped, audio taped, and these tapes will be available for sale in the lobby. Any transcripts that you'd like to have from any of the panels, please contact the representative for the audio transcripts in the lobby. I also to announce a little change in the panel speakers. We have with us a speaker who came recently from the West Bank, and I will introduce her later on, and that was a change from what's listed in the program under the name Dahoud Kuttab. He was not able to make it this afternoon. The subject of this panel is timely, of course, with everything that's going on. It's called The Implications of the West Bank Uprising. And with us here are 4 distinguished speakers who are going to be addressing various things in regards to the uprising and in regards to the implication of what's going on right now in the occupied territories, and also what's going on in regards to American Jewish community and the U.S. policy toward the Middle East. We're running a little late, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the night. Our first speaker is Dr. William Kwan. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute since 1979. He was also on the National Council. He served twice on the National Security Council as a senior staff member. He's got his doctoral degree in political science from MIT in 1968, and he has several publications. Some were Camp David, the Peacemaking and Politics, the Saudi Arabia in the 1980s, Foreign Policy, Security and Oil, and various others that he has published. Please help me welcome Dr. William Kwan.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I think the topic could not be more timely. We're all fascinated by watching the transformation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into a new dimension. And the aspect of this dramatic change that I want to talk about has to do with how I see American policy reacting, evolving, perhaps changing in response to these events. Needless to say, I do not speak officially for my government. It gives me a fair amount of latitude. We fortunately, however, do have someone from the administration to correct any misstatements that I make. Last December, before the uprising began, I think it is clear that the Reagan administration had no intention of launching any new initiatives to bring about Arab-Israeli peace. It simply was not viewed as a high priority topic. It was not believed that significant American interests were at risk. And the prior record of efforts that had been made had left a rather sour taste in the mouths of those who had been involved with them. In addition, the Arab Summit meeting that had taken place in Amman in November was interpreted in Washington, perhaps incorrectly, as indicating that the Arab world no longer cared very much about the Palestinian question, and that instead they were preoccupied with the threat from Iran and a concern with the Gulf War. 3 months later, after continued demonstrations by Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza that the occupation is simply intolerable, the United States is now again deeply, and I believe in an important way, involved in a new initiative. The questions I want to raise about this initiative, and at least I want to start the discussion of them, is first, is it really a serious initiative? Is it meant merely to calm things down so we can all go back to business as usual, or is it meant to set in motion a process that could ultimately bring about a peaceful resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and particularly the Israeli-Palestinian dimension of it? Secondly, does it have any real chance of succeeding? Obviously, I can't predict the future, but I can at least give you my assessment of prospects. First, what is the initiative? At the risk of boring some of you who have been poring over all of this flood of documents that has been coming out, of letters from Schultz to Shamir and so forth, let me at least outline what I think the main and important elements of the initiative are, and then move on to the discussion of whether it is a serious initiative. First, the American proposal starts by saying that the objective of the exercise is a comprehensive peace based on 242, UN resolutions 242 and 338. That's pretty standard boilerplate language, as we would say. But then there's a new element. It says that the first step in the process should be the convening of an international conference to be convened by the UN Secretary General with the participation of all 5 members of the Security Council, permanent members, invitations to be issued by the Secretary General, and perhaps optimistically, but nonetheless this is part of the scenario, it is put forward as a possibility that such a conference would begin as early as next month. Now, this is somewhat new for this administration, to come down solidly in favor of the international conference. So that's probably the first new element in the proposal. We've talked about an international conference. We've been more or less enthusiastic over the past couple of years, but this is the first time, to my knowledge, in an official document that we have come out solidly in favor of it. The second point of the initiative is that negotiations should begin on a bilateral basis shortly after the convening of the international conference, perhaps as early as May. And then with respect to the Jordanian-Palestinian-Israeli set of issues, negotiations would concentrate first on a set of so-called transitional arrangements, which has the sound of Camp David about it. Not necessarily good or bad, but just to remind you where this concept comes from. And it is specifically said that as those negotiations begin, the United States will put forward a proposal of its own for the purposes of starting the negotiations. And again, I don't think the United States has ever committed itself to putting forward the negotiating text, or at least to start the negotiations. So it's a little bit different, but it's essentially the Camp David concept of negotiating a transitional arrangement. Third, there is a timeline which has attracted considerable attention, specifying certain dates by which things should be accomplished. I wouldn't take these overly seriously, but it does set a kind of set of targets. The negotiations on the transitional arrangement should be concluded within 6 months, which would mean in the fall sometime. And if agreement is reached, those new arrangements for the West Bank and Gaza should go into effect within a few months thereafter. Now, somewhere in between the end of these negotiations on transitional arrangements and the actual beginning of new transitional regime for the West Bank and Gaza, negotiations on the so-called final status of the territories would begin, perhaps in December. And these, according to the American proposal, should be based on all of the principles of UN Resolution 242. And it has been made very clear by Secretary Schultz that this means the application of the so-called territories for peace equation to both the West Bank Gaza front and to the Golan Heights. The final point in the proposal is that Palestinians are to be represented in a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation, and that it is that delegation which is expected to negotiate all aspects of the Palestinian question. Now, is this a serious proposal? Obviously, this is my subjective interpretation, what I'm going to say. I would say it is a serious proposal, and it is the most serious proposal yet put forward by the Reagan administration. I'm not sure it's as serious as I would like it to be, but it's more serious than anything we have seen in the past 7 years, including, I think, President Reagan's speech on September 1st, 1982, which in content was in some ways attractive and impressive, but there was no sense of follow-through or real commitment to it. Now, if it is serious, let's think about why it might be. What is the American administration concerned with? Why now might they be serious in a way that they weren't before? I think the answer has to derive from a sense of threat to American national interests. Americans don't get involved in major initiatives simply because they have had a change of heart or simply because they're appalled at what they see on the television screen. That may help set the stage for a serious initiative, but there has to be some sense that American interests are at risk. And I think there is some perception that the events unleashed in the last 3 months can damage American national interests at some point in the future. Why? First, because I think they see that the uprising contains within it the potential to really radicalize the Middle East in an important way. And as all of you know, I'm sure Americans don't feel comfortable in a radicalized Middle East, whether it is on the left or on the right. The longer the uprising goes on, the more pressure will be brought on the so-called moderate Arab regimes who are our primary friends in the Arab world. There is also concern that the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, which is now nearly a decade old, the peace relationship, could come under pressure if the uprising goes on indefinitely. The Egyptians will have to take a stand, will have to be concerned with the effect it's having on their own opinion, and ultimately it could be quite damaging to that relationship, which is very much a centerpiece of American strategy in the region. I think it is also believed by the administration that as the uprising goes on and as the Israelis react to it, that the hard line in Israel will become even harder, that the extremists will prevail, and that ultimately it will be the Sharons and the people of that part of the Israeli political spectrum who will benefit. And there is relatively little confidence, and I might say, that those are the Israelis with whom ultimately peace can be negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians. And then finally, I think for this administration in particular, which is, I think, without question the most pro-Israeli administration we have seen in a long, long time, particularly the President and the Secretary of State, there is a genuine concern with the damage that could ultimately be done to U.S.-Israeli relations as this goes on. They sense, I think correctly, that American public opinion is reacting with great concern to these events as they watch Israeli soldiers beating teenagers and breaking their bones. So out of a concern for Israel, I believe this administration is trying to push the peace process forward, even though in doing so, they will occasionally appear to be confronting the current Israeli leadership on a number of issues. Finally, there is always the concern about the Soviet Union taking advantage of new developments in the Middle East, and this is a Soviet leadership which is respected. Until Gorbachev had consolidated his power, there was a tendency to say that the Soviets are so preoccupied with their internal affairs, with transitional problems as one Soviet leader after another would die, that we weren't too worried about their activities in the Middle East. That is no longer the case. The Soviets are active throughout the region as they disengage from Afghanistan. If they do, they're going to have better opportunities to develop relations in the Arab world, including with Saudi Arabia. And I think there is concern on the American side that if this conflict deepens between Israel and the Palestinians, the Soviets will emerge as the champions of the Palestinian cause, as they have traditionally been, and this will be ultimately to our disadvantage. Now, the timing of the American initiative, I think, has to do with several developments, and Mr. Hirsch can tell us more in detail. But I think sometime in January, they got a signal from Mr. Shamir that hinted that there might be some flexibility in his position. Secondly, they came under considerable pressure from American Jewish leaders to do something. And I think that's a new development, to have American Jewish leaders coming into the administration saying, get active in the Middle East. Whenever I was in government, it was always just the opposite. Stay out of the Middle East question. Stay out of the Arab-Israeli question. Anything you do will make things worse. Now, they were coming to Schultz and saying, get involved, do something, put some pressure on. And then the visit of President Mubarak came at a very important time to help to crystallize and force decisions on the American side. And I think President Mubarak was quite effective, not with his formal official plan, but with his private comments to the administration and to others in the American foreign policy community. So sometime in the second half of January, a decision was made to go forward with an initiative. The contents of the initiative is a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it's hard to judge whether it is artfully crafted, but I will come to its strengths and shortcomings in a moment. Now, the intentions, do they simply want to quiet things down, to restore calm? Certainly that's part of it. All of the points I made about the concern of radicalization, undermining moderate regimes, stems from a belief that the longer this goes on, the more dangerous it could become. But I think they also recognize that you cannot simply go back to where things were last fall, relative quiescence in the West Bank and Gaza. You can't put this genie back in the bottle, so to speak, once it's come out. And that therefore, if you're going to end the uprising, it has to be through political means. I don't think the administration accepts the notion that this is a law and order problem that can be solved simply by the application of force or beatings. I do think they have the understanding that a political solution of some sort is essential. They may not recognize what kind of political solution is called for, but at least they understand the link to political initiatives. Now, what are the prospects for this initiative? Obviously, it's risky to try to predict the course of an initiative that is still in a very early stage and where very major moves are going to take place in the next few days. But just for the sake of interest, let me try to give you my assessment of where things might go. My sense is that neither the Israelis nor the key Arab players want to say no in any definitive way at this point, nor do they want to embrace the initiative. So I think that for some period of time there's going to be ambiguity about the response. There will be grave expressions of doubt. We heard some of those apparently from Mr. Shamir today, who said the only thing he liked about the letter from Mr. Schultz was the signature on it. Doesn't perhaps encourage you to think that there will be a big breakthrough next week. And I think that Shamir will fight very hard on three specific points. He will reject the international conference, perhaps quoting Henry Kissinger as an authority on how dangerous this all is. He will reject the concept of territories for peace as applying to the West Bank and Gaza, as he already has in his letter to the 30 senators. And he will reject the idea of compressing the time scale. On the Jordanian and Palestinian and Syrian side, I think there will be also negative reactions. There will be concern that the conference isn't a serious one, that the territory for peace issue has not been spelled out. A lot of ambiguities, and most importantly for the Palestinians, the conditions for Palestinian representation are not acceptable. My own assessment, very quickly, there are some positive elements in what the Schultz initiative is putting forward. There's a renewed sense of American involvement and responsibility for pushing the peace process forward. And I think that's good, particularly in an election year. It helps prevent the kind of craziness that otherwise can set in an election year where we start calling for moving the embassy to Jerusalem and other profoundly stupid things. Instead, we're going to, if we have any political debate at all in this country, it's going to be over a peace initiative, not over side issues. Secondly, we are talking to the Soviets and to the Syrians, which we were not doing a year or two ago, and accepting that they are players in the game. That's very important for this administration to do. Third, we have embraced the idea, perhaps without enthusiasm, of an international conference. I'm not wildly enthusiastic about the notion of an international conference, but I think it is the only framework or format that is going to be acceptable. So getting it out on the table is a helpful step. And I think accepting that there will have to be two interlinked phases of negotiations on transitional arrangements and on the final settlement is also desirable. Of course, repeating that 242 applies to the West Bank and Gaza. The withdrawal is part of the ultimate peace settlement. It's nothing new, but it's important to have again. The weaknesses, very quickly as I see them, first and foremost, we are still trying to avoid dealing directly with the Palestinians. We are only proposing to deal with Palestinians as part of a Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. And I think if there is a clear message from the uprising, it is that that simply will not be accepted. The Palestinians will insist on being represented by spokesmen of their own choosing in their own right. So I think ultimately we and the Israelis are going to have to accept that reality. Secondly, there is still ambiguity about this territory for peace question. It is not in the Schultz to Shamir letter. What you will read instead is that all the principles of UN Resolution 242 should be the basis for negotiations on all fronts. Well, that sounds like it means something, but I hate to tell you it doesn't, because Mr. Shamir has the answer for that one, and it was in his letter to the senators. It is that we've already discharged our obligation to withdraw from occupied territories by leaving Sinai, nothing more. And I think until this issue is more clearly focused on, we still have a little time bomb waiting to go off if negotiations ever really get started. And finally, there is the great big question of substance if negotiations ever did get underway. Now, just what to watch for in the weeks ahead. What will Mr. Shamir say? Mr. Hirsch can perhaps give us a preview, except he's a diplomat, so he won't. What will the Soviets say? That will be very interesting. If the Soviets were by chance to accept this initiative, it changes a lot. If instead they reject it completely, that also, I think, makes it very difficult for the Arab parties to join in. And finally, there is still an open possibility that Secretary Schultz will meet with the Palestinian delegation, perhaps here in Washington. Were he to do that, again, I think it would be a step in the right direction. The odds are clearly against success. If by success one means getting formal negotiations started, leading toward formal agreements. But in this business, one has to measure success also for changing the way Americans think about the issue. We're getting some of the building blocks in place, not so that we can get a quick fix solution this year, but so that this year and next year we can begin the serious process of using American influence, which is substantial, on behalf of peace and justice in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. You have started hitting on an issue that really rose eyebrows with everybody, not only today, but for the last 2 months, and that's regarding the American Jewish community and the responses. And with us today also is the second speaker is Mark Cohen. Mr. Cohen is a Washington, D.C. attorney and legal editor. He's a former assistant professor of communication at Antioch College in Ohio, and is currently completing his master's degree in international and comparative law in the Georgetown University Law Center. Mr. Cohen is a founder and publication chairman of the Jewish Committee for Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and he's the editor of the committee's newsletter. Mr. Cohen will be speaking on exactly what Dr. Kwan wrote, and that is the American Jewish response to the Palestinian uprising. Mr. Mark Cohen.
Thank you for the very warm reception. There was a cartoon, I don't know how many of you saw it. It originally appeared in the Boston Globe. I saw it when it was reprinted in the Washington Post. If you missed it, I thought it summarized, at least until this letter appeared from the 30 senators, pretty much the sense of what was happening in the United States, at least, regarding the uprising. There are two characters in this cartoon. There are 4 frames of the cartoon. One is a U.S. congressman, and the other character is a constituent reading the newspaper. And the constituent says, "Israel is killing Palestinian protesters." The congressman says, "A tragic breakdown in communication." The citizen says, "Beating their children and silencing their leaders." The congressman says, "A deplorable dialogue of death." The constituent says, "What are you going to do about it?" And the congressman goes, and then, aha, close the Palestinian mission to the United Nations. If you haven't heard, by the way, apparently at 4:30 today, the Justice Department plans to do just that. There was a rather remarkable article that appeared recently in print. You may not have seen it. It wasn't in the New York Times and the Washington Post or Time or Newsweek. And I suspect that there aren't too many subscribers out there to the Washington Jewish Week. So I'm going to tell you about this article. It appeared in the February 11th issue of the Washington Jewish Week. It's a news analysis piece by a fellow named Eric Rosenman, who's the editor, as you may know, of the Near East Report, the newsletter of AIPAC, the Israel lobby. The article is entitled "The End of the Zionist Century." In it, Rosenman predicted the imminent establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. We're talking about the editor of AIPAC's newsletter. And he says that this will happen, is catalyzed by the Palestinian uprising. He isn't sanguine about this regarding Israeli security, but he thinks it's coming. As he sees the situation, it's one thing for Israel to absorb 50,000 Druze, but it's another thing for Israel to try to absorb 2.2 million Arabs west of the Jordan River. And he says somewhere between 50,000 and 2.2 million, the demographic red line was crossed. Then came the analogies with Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, and South Africa. Rosenman pins the problem, this demographic dilemma, on 2 factors. One is a higher Arab birth rate. The other, though, is that the ingathering of the exiles from the West expected by the forefathers of Zionism never occurred, and that's because Jews in the West don't think of themselves as being in exile. Of course, Rosenman's predictions don't a Palestinian state make, but they do reflect a fundamental rethinking of the kind of assumptions in the American Jewish community that's current today. And given the muscle flexing in recent years of the pro-Israel lobby, it's easy to forget that political Zionism was a minority movement among American Jews until the Holocaust. After World War II, the need for a national sanctuary had become self-evident to Jews, and with the creation of Israel, Judaism as a religion and Zionism as a political idea were largely fused in Jewish consciousness, even in the diaspora. Support for tiny, struggling Israel came to be a secular religion for American Jews. The role assigned the American faithful was to send money and foster a responsive climate for Israeli concerns in the United States. And we constantly reminded one another Israel was embattled, it was threatened by implacable Arabs bent on their destruction, and yet still an oasis of democracy, liberalism, even socialism. And after the Six-Day War in 1967, there was a new selling point, Spartan Israel, as a strategic asset of the United States. But the celebration of Jewish military prowess was short-lived. The 73 war with Egypt and Syria was a close call for Israel, a reminder of national mortality. Throughout these years, Israel was ruled by the Labor Party. There was then considerable pride in Israel here among American Jews, a feeling of ethnic and ideological kinship binding the largely liberal American Jewish community and the leaders of Israel. The rise in 1977 of Menachem Begin and the Likud Party was a troubling development for American Jews, bred on a vision of Israel as a land of kibbutzim and as a bearer of Enlightenment values. Begin's history with the terrorist Irgun could not but subvert Israel's claim to the high ground in combating the PLO. Begin's biblically based assertion of sovereignty over the occupied territories, what he called Judea and Samaria, caused considerable confusion and discomfort among American Jews. But this discomfort was largely kept within the confines of the American Jewish community. The Camp David peace accords with Egypt temporarily elevated Begin to the status of a statesman, but it also raised the hopes that a final settlement to the Israeli-Arab conflict could be had and Israeli security secured. Those hopes were soon put on ice, along with Camp David's purported promise of Palestinian self-rule. The 1982 debacle in Lebanon, driven by Ariel Sharon's obsession with militarily destroying the PLO, was a turning point for American Jews. It was the first event to force the realization that Israel's military might was available not solely for defensive purposes. Israel, in the eyes of many Americans, had become a bully on the Middle East bloc. As in Israel, first a few, then many Jews in the United States protested the invasion. We signed newspaper ads, we picketed when Begin or Sharon came to the U.S., and we sponsored public forums featuring Israeli peace camp leaders or Palestinians who were willing to stand on a podium for events sponsored by Jewish groups which supported Israel's right to exist. A serious rupture developed among American Jewish leaders over the Lebanon invasion. The last few years have seen further tensions between Israeli and American Jews. The Pollard spy affair, Iran-Contra, conflict over Israel's insistence that Soviet emigres go to Israel whether they want to go there or somewhere else. The stranglehold over religious life that the Orthodox rabbinate exerts over Israel, Israeli-South African ties, the rise of Kahane, lots of things. But especially the belief that Shamir has not been sufficiently forthcoming in seeking an accommodation with the Palestinians. All this has added strain to the relations between the Jewish leadership in the United States and in Israel. Last July, an ad appeared in the New York Times signed by leading members of the American Jewish community and Israelis associated with the peace camp there, calling for Israelis and Palestinians to recognize each other's national rights. Among the American signers were individuals who had actually supported the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Last October, the 50,000-member American Jewish Congress issued a call for an international peace conference, putting itself directly at odds with the Shamir government. Since then, other organizations have followed suit with similar, if somewhat less forthright appeals. Contrary to the conventional wisdom propagated by the Israel lobby, even prior to the current Palestinian uprising, American Jewish attitudes regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are relatively moderate. An American Jewish Committee survey taken in 1986 showed a substantial plurality of American Jews favor a right of a Palestinian homeland so long as it doesn't threaten Israel's security. That Prime Minister Shamir and his Likud party have not been sufficiently accommodating with Palestinians to make a peace, and that Foreign Minister Peres is far more popular than is Shamir. And Peres, as you know, favors an international peace conference of some sort, and he favors some sort of territory for peace compromise, whereas Shamir opposes such an international conference and opposes any accommodation regarding the territories. Before the Lebanon invasion, the impulse to be protective of Israel chilled most any public discussion within the American Jewish community regarding Israeli policies. But by 1986, the American Jewish Committee poll found that by a 63 to 22% margin, American Jews rejected the notion that they should not criticize Israel. Attachment to Israel among American Jews, while very high, is on the decline. The American Jewish Committee survey found that only among the Orthodox, approximately 10% of the American Jewish public, is attachment to Israel on the rise. Reform Jews and unaffiliated, 55% of the population, among those groups, attachment to Israel is on the decline. There's little survey data about the response to the uprising yet available from the American Jewish community. I understand the American Jewish Committee plans such a study soon. A Gallup poll taken in mid-January in New York of Jews found that 39% said Israeli handling of the riots was too harsh, 38% thought it was just right, 6% thought it was too lenient, and 17% did not know. But that doesn't give us much hard data to go on. For the ideologically committed, the uprising has pretty much confirmed their pre-existing notions. The hawks are all the more convinced that Arabs represent a security threat to Israel and need to be severely suppressed. The peace camp is all the more convinced that the occupation of the territories is a cancer destroying Israeli society. Beyond these pre-existing currents, there has been a considerable, if uneven, movement in the direction of the peace camp. The movement is not linear. Rather, as one of the Jewish leaders I spoke with in preparing for this panel said, it's more like a seesaw. The very same person one moment will be anguished, upset, and angered by scenes of Israeli brutality and official intransigence, and in the next moment furious over a media double standard, villainizing Israel for conduct which less open Arab regimes get away with without any media opprobrium. Rabin's beatings policy elicits shock, sadness, and apprehension among American Jews over what Israel is becoming. PLO attributable acts of anti-civilian violence instantly transform distant Palestinians from sympathetic victims into cold-blooded murderers deserving of whatever retribution the Israelis dish out. Nonetheless, indications of the trend abound, and the seesaw is tilting toward the peace camp. Perhaps the most pointed development is now this famous letter from 30 U.S. senators, all favorites of the Israel lobby, criticizing Shamir's obstructive behavior and stating that the basis of a peace settlement has to be land for peace. The letter was circulated by Senators Levin and Boschwitz from Michigan and Minnesota, a bipartisan group, both of whom are Jewish. It was supported by 3 of the other 5 Jewish senators in the Senate, Metzenbaum, Lautenberg, and Rudman. And it had the support of Cranston from California, Moynihan of New York, and Graham of Florida, all of whom come from states where there is substantial Jewish political influence. Such a letter would have been unimaginable prior to the uprising and the harsh Israeli response. Yitzhak Shamir was so taken back by the letter that he felt compelled to respond and try to stuff the genie of Jewish-led American protest back into the bottle. There are numerous other signs of the trend in American Jewish thinking. Noteworthy Jewish personalities, not heretofore known for taking any sort of stand regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, like Woody Allen, find themselves on the op-ed pages. Change is evident even among hardcore supporters of Israel. Martin Peretz, the editor-in-chief of the New Republic, recently wrote that, and this is a quote, "The occupation no longer provides any margin of safety. It has become a drain on Israel's sense of self, its most valuable asset." A significant number of prominent Jewish leaders have been forthright in their condemnation of Israeli conduct and intransigence. When the Israeli Consul General in New York, Moshe Yegar, accused Jewish critics of comforting Israel's enemies, former Conference of Major Jewish Organizations President Alexander Schindler shot back that sometimes you serve the state's security by dissenting. Maybe if I and other American Jewish leaders had been stronger in the early 1980s, Israel would not have had that disaster in Beirut. Although some organized Jewish voices, notably the B'nai B'rith and the Zionist Organization of America, have responded hawkishly, most mainstream American Jewish leadership, after issuing reflexive protests against media bias and PLO instigation of the uprising, have struck, for them, an independent pose. While issuing an obligatory reassurance of solid support for Israel, even a conservative figure like Morris Abrams, the current president of the Conference of Major Jewish Organizations, felt compelled to announce in Jerusalem that the status quo is not indefinitely acceptable to American Jews and that, quote, "the occupation is the cause of the disturbances," unquote. Behind closed doors, Abrams and company, I'm told, are warning Israelis that there's a danger of U.S. support eroding and the problem is one of substance, not simply bad public relations. This mild show of independence is not well appreciated among all Israelis. Rightists there are alarmed about the public venting of American Jewish criticism. Former ambassador to the United States, Knesset member Moshe Ahrens, took to the op-ed pages recently to chastise Israel's friends turned critics. The Jerusalem Post reported on an Israeli diplomat's account of a late February meeting in Los Angeles of the National Jewish Community Relations Council. The diplomat found erosion of support for Israeli policies so deep that among the delegates there that he wrote, "It's easier to participate in international conferences with Goyim than in a convention of Jewish community representatives." I'm sure there's some hyperbole there, but I think that the point was well taken. The much-feared AIPAC has run for cover since the uprising began. When some 80 people, including many Jews, recently lobbied on Capitol Hill for a congressional resolution calling for the reinstatement of municipal elections in the occupied territories, congressional aides were asking these peace lobbyists, what's become of AIPAC? AIPAC has been virtually silent, and when it's not silent, it's not been very effective. In fact, Senator Levin turned a deaf ear to AIPAC Director Tom Dine's request that references to exchanging land for peace be deleted from the letter to Secretary Schultz from the 30 senators. The print and electronic news media, once dismissed as a thinly camouflaged Israeli mouthpiece, have done a largely admirable job in covering the uprising. And the op-ed pages of the daily newspapers have been unusually available to those critical of Israeli conduct. The journal Tikkun, an increasingly important voice of progressive Judaism, is calling in its March editorial for a demilitarized Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and is sending copies of the editorial to every rabbi in America and to 300,000 Jewish opinion leaders. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the national body representing Reform Judaism, plans forums on the current situation in the territories in 300 Jewish communities around the country. The forums will reflect a diversity of views, but the sponsors are making sure that the peace point of view emerges. A recent forum in Atlanta, sponsored by the UAHC, attracted 1,400 people. And I can go on with many other indicators, but suffice it to note that the encouragement Jewish leaders have given to Secretary Schultz's initiative, as Dr. Cohen pointed out, represents a significant shift in the trend among American Jews. In preparing for this panel, I spoke with a number of Jewish leaders from a variety of organizations, trying to make sure that I accurately reflected not my own views to you, but also what the thinking is in the Jewish community. And I'd like to share with you some responses I got from Jewish leaders. A common refrain was that public soul-searching in the Jewish community should not be mistaken for an erosion of support for Israel's basic cause, as opposed to particular policies. They expressed a great desire for a settlement of the conflict. For most American Jewish leaders, apprehension about exchanging territory for peace is not an ideologically based one connected with restoration of a biblical kingdom of Israel. It's much more rooted in questions of practical security concerns. The leaders expressed a deepening appreciation of Palestinian desperation and a need for territorial compromise, and they recognized the validity of Palestinian nationalism and the need for a Palestinian homeland, although their preference is that it be somehow associated with Jordan. These leaders see a vocal, growing, but still a minority tendency within the American Jewish community which favors direct talks with the PLO. Most of them do not, even when they recognize that the PLO represents most Palestinians. Yet they're open to the prospect of PLO or Palestinian participation in some kind of joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. In closing, I'd like to relate a very revealing exchange I had with a prominent liberal Jewish leader. He would offer the following not too surprising advice to this convention, if asked for his views. To do something practical, perhaps historical right now, he said, there's no way to be effective without dealing with the legitimacy of Israel and Israel's security needs as a precondition for becoming a bona fide player. I responded that such recognition for Israel's needs is probably a little less likely now in the heat of the uprising, but I asked hypothetically, what would the response be of American Jewish leaders were this convention to take a decision acknowledging Israel's legitimacy and security needs? And he stumbled for a second, as if he had reached a bridge he had never been forced to cross before. And then he admitted the American Jewish leaders, they would freak out. I said it would call their bluff. He said, yeah, it would call their bluff. And whether you wish to call their bluff or not is for you to decide, not me. In any case, we in the Jewish Committee for Israeli-Palestinian Peace will continue seeking an end to the occupation, territorial compromise, and real Palestinian representation at an international peace conference. And we look forward to the day when AIPAC's Eric Rosenman's prediction is realized and Palestinians at last have a state to call their own.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I know we started a little late, and I'm sure you've been sitting long enough here, so I'm going to call a 5-minute break so all of you can stand up and stretch, and then we'll continue with the program. You want to go ahead with the program? Okay, we'll go ahead with the program. I have been outvoted here 5-5. Our next speaker is Dr. John Hirsch. Dr. Hirsch is from the State Department. He's the director of the Office of Israel and Arab-Israeli Affairs. He has a long career as a Foreign Service officer. He served as the Consul General in Genoa in 1966 when he first started his career. He also served as a political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv from 73 to 76. In addition to that, he was at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. He was advisor in the Middle East and Cyprus. He served as deputy director in the Office of Israel and Arab-Israeli Affairs back in 1980 to 81 also. And he's been in that position as the director since July 1977. We're going to hear from We're going to hear from Dr. Hirsch about the nature of the uprising, the U.S. policy on the issue, and all other questions that might come out after that. Please help me welcome Mr. John Hirsch.
Well, I'm very glad to see from your response to Bill Kwan's suggestion about what I would say about Mr. Shamir's visit that the standing of the profession of diplomacy is still very high. And since Bill has told I also will not go over all the points that he has made. I'm very, very glad to be here today, and I appreciate this invitation to be with you to talk about the implications of the uprising which has taken place since early December in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Throughout 1987 and the beginning of this year, members of the NAAA and the ADC have met regularly with senior officers, senior officials in the Department of State, including last month with Secretary Schultz and on 2 other occasions with Deputy Secretary John Whitehead in an open exchange of views on issues that are of concern to all of us. And I look on my own appearance here today as a continuation of that dialogue. I think this is a somber and a sober moment for every person who's concerned to see an end to the protracted conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people. There have been many, I think far too many, lost opportunities for a resolution of this conflict over the past 40 years. All of us who are working day in and day out on the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians have shared with all of you what I'm sure is your feeling of sorrow and concern over what is now close to 85 Palestinians, maybe even more today, who have lost their lives since early December. But those sentiments don't change anything. As such, this moment of time, I think, is an opportunity for a fresh effort to be made by all parties in Israel and in the Arab world to move out of the gridlock which has persisted for so long. And that opportunity is the significance of Secretary Schultz's current initiative and of his recent visits to the Middle East and the diplomatic efforts that are underway. I want to say a brief word about my sense of the nature of the conflict and then comment briefly to you on the implications of the uprising as I see them, and then say some more about U.S. policy in somewhat broader terms than I won't repeat what Bill has said to you. This is a conflict of two competing nationalisms, Israeli and Palestinian, both of which claim historic and cultural ties to the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. I remember when I served at our embassy in Tel Aviv that Lova Eliav, who in that time was the Secretary General of the Israeli Labor Party, once described the conflict in the following way. He said, I'm paraphrasing, that Israelis have a right to all of that land and that Palestinians have a right to all of that land, and that in his view the only reasonable thing to do was to work out a compromise by which the land can be shared by both Israelis and Palestinians. And I personally think that is the correct approach. I heard, this was on a videotape, Tom Friedman of the New York Times say in these very days that neither side can save itself, both as regards its own aspirations and in order to avoid further violence unless it saves the other. The conflict cannot be resolved if it is perceived on either side as a zero-sum game. That's my general view, the nature of this conflict. The uprising has been an essentially spontaneous and indigenous reaction to 21 years of occupation. It reflects accumulated frustrations and a sense of despair that the situation would not change. Once the uprising started, it began to receive a certain amount of direction from outside, but its extent is unclear. What is the implication of this situation for the future? I'll put it very simply to you. I think it can go one of two ways. This moment in time can be simply another phase in the long struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, leading to further and perhaps and probably more intense violence over a long, protracted period. Or it can conceivably open up a real opportunity for both Israelis and Palestinians to re-examine their attitudes and assumptions, to reflect on whether they want more or less permanent conflict at great expense to both sides, or are prepared to strike a genuine compromise with each other. I think there are challenges to all of us in this situation. For Israel, the challenge is to overcome the split, the virtual paralysis that has attended the national unity government. The challenge is to conduct a debate among themselves about the real issues. What kind of Israel do they want? What kind of relationship do they want with their neighbors? And what kind of compromises and risks are they ready to take? That debate, to some extent, had already begun last year, but the uprising and the Secretary's initiative brings that debate, I think, into clearer focus. And I think it will be the debate of the election in Israel this year. For Palestinians, the same questions about the future they envisage apply. The uprising, as I have said, is an expression of frustration at 21 years of occupation. But from all of this violence, if there is no realistic acceptance of Israel, any peace effort will falter. For us, Americans, the challenge, and for the United States government, in whatever administration is in power, the challenge is to seek to play a constructive role in this very difficult situation, to be prepared to use our good offices, to provide ideas. Right now, we're trying to be the catalyst to get a negotiating process going, and then to act as a mediator if that negotiating process can be engaged. However, the United States can only play this role, in my view, if the people in the region are genuinely ready to make the hard decisions and necessary compromises. In the 1970s, first President Sadat in 1973, and then President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin in 1977, for their respective national interests, set the stage for effective United States mediation. Today, unlike the 1970s, there is no single charismatic leader, nor a single catalytic event. I don't regard the uprising as such as a single catalytic event, at least not so far. Thus, in my view, there is the much more difficult need for Israelis and Palestinians to recognize that mutual acceptance is the only alternative to continued conflict. And those who want peace have to seize this opportunity. Let me say something now about the American approach to the peace process. And I have a slightly different perspective from what Bill Quandt said and what some others have said at other platforms on which I've appeared, which speak, and he's not used these words, but others have, about sort of inconstancy and endless fluctuation and it all being erratic and unpredictable. One can argue about the intensity of an effort or particular moments, but I believe that the role and approach of the United States to the peace process has been based on certain fundamentals ever since 1967, which cut across political lines. Democratic administrations and Republican administrations have had in the main focus the same ideas. And those fundamental ideas are embodied in Resolutions 242 and 338. And those are, with all respect to Bill's comments, not just boilerplate. The concept of Israel's right to live within secure borders and of an exchange of land taken by Israel in the 1967 war for peace as the basis for resolving the status of the territories captured in that war is fundamental and has to be taken not just as two numbers on a computer screen. Contrary to a widely held view, the United States has recognized for a long time that the legitimate interests of the Palestinian people need to be addressed in any lasting settlement. President Johnson said this in 1967. Secretary Kissinger said it explicitly at the Geneva Conference in December 1973. President Carter reiterated the same point in Clinton, Massachusetts in March 1977. You'll all remember he spoke about a Palestinian homeland, and it was clearly affirmed by Egypt, Israel, and ourselves in the Camp David Accords. And the Reagan administration has repeated this recognition over the last 7 years. The autonomy negotiations which were conducted between 1979 and 1982, first by Robert Strauss, then by Saul Linowitz, and subsequently by then Secretary Haig, were intended to provide the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza with genuine self-government as an interim step toward a final settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict, exactly the first part of the initiative that Bill summarized for you a few moments ago. These ideas were also the basis of President Reagan's initiative of September 1, 1982, which envisaged first a transitional period, again, in which authority would be transferred from Israel to the Palestinian inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza, and then final status negotiations based on the territory for peace principle of Resolution 242 would take place. While obviously none of these proposals have yet produced the intended results, and while they have been heavily criticized both in the Arab world and in parts of Israel, they represent constructive efforts on our part, on the American part, to address the concerns of Israel and the Palestinians in a realistic manner. No one else that I know of has come up with a constructive alternative, and it remains the case that the United States continue to be viewed both in Israel and in the Arab world as the only effective interlocutor. The Soviet Union has been unable to play that role, not least because of the absence of diplomatic relations with Israel. For several years, as I think many of you know, we have sought, this was sort of over the period 1985 to 1987, to resolve the procedural issues arising from Jordan's requirement for an international conference and Israel's requirement for direct negotiations. The new initiative now that Bill has spoken to is an effort to go beyond the impasse which had arisen, to offer a new blend of ideas, kind of a mixture, which would accelerate the negotiating process and address the concerns in this specific focus of both Israel and Jordan and the Palestinian people. We also want negotiations between Israel and Syria and Israel and Lebanon, in other words, all of Israel's neighbors. As the Secretary said when he came to Israel on the 25th of February, the goal is a comprehensive peace. There's again this statement that it's another sort of split and divide approach. It needs a realistic vision, he said, by all the parties, and he said that the goal is to help Israel and its neighbors achieve peace and security and help the Palestinians achieve their legitimate rights. He also said that Palestinian participation in the peace process is essential, that the immediate goal is to bring about a quick change in that situation, and that the Palestinians should participate in negotiations to determine their future. Now I want to say a few words about the United States and the PLO. I recognize that many of you, perhaps, believe that the key to breaking this deadlock and to giving the Palestinians a proper voice in the peace process would be for the United States to meet with the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat. Before you applaud further, I don't mean that I'm supporting that. Many people point to our discussions with the Viet Cong in the 1970s or the
slip of the tongue.
Or the Secretary's meeting with Oliver Tambo of the ANC as relevant precedents. The abstract logic of this case, which is derived from the October 1974 decision of the Arab Summit at Rabat, that the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, is clear, but in my view, the political case is not. It is not simply a matter of arbitrarily sticking to Secretary Kissinger's undertaking to then Foreign Minister alone, nor is it the power of the pro-Israel lobby. It is rather that the PLO, in our view, becomes a valid interlocutor only when it unequivocally renounces terror and accepts unequivocally Israel's right to exist and resolutions 242 and 338, which I have discussed, which the entire international community have accepted as the basis for peace. The PLO has not done so. Above all, it is Israel, not the United States, which the PLO has to persuade of its bona fide intentions. A number of people have told me that the PLO has already taken this step, as some of you are saying right now. I can only say that this is not the case. We have received no such communication from the PLO or any Arab government. Other people say this is a PLO trump card to be played only in exchange for mutual recognition. The situation we're living in is not a card game. Palestinian lives and the future of the Palestinian people are at stake. The time, I think, is past for hesitation and conditionality. Now I want to say a word about, that was what I wrote a few days ago. As Mark told you, the Department of Justice is announcing today the decision to proceed with the requirement of Congress to move to close the PLO observer mission in New York. The Secretary of State, speaking at the White House lawn a few hours ago, said that he thought it was one of the dumber decisions of the Congress. He said that he had opposed the legislation, but that the executive branch must carry forward the requirements of American law. That is the situation at hand. The next step may be litigation, but I wanted to let you know what the announcement's being made, or probably has been made, and the immediate reaction of the Secretary. I want to raise one other topic very briefly, which is the question of whether the United States can or should seek to force Israel to accept an imposed settlement. This approach has underlain a lot of the enormous effort which has been invested in getting international support for the Palestinian position at the United Nations. The goal of that effort has been, to, as I've read it, and in the years I was up there, has been to try to persuade the United States to accept the need for an imposed settlement and then somehow to get us to impose it. This has been the meaning of the annual resolutions up there on the question of Palestine, and specifically of the resolution introduced there every year calling for an international conference whose entire outcome is to be predetermined by its terms of reference. And I mention this not because I want to ascribe some particular importance to resolutions of the General Assembly, but because it reflects this idea that's been persistent of a coerced outcome. And this is simply not a viable approach, and it's certainly not our policy. The United States cannot impose a settlement on any of the parties. The days when Eisenhower told Ben-Gurion that Israel had to leave the Sinai are past. And everyone who's concerned about the conflict's continuation must realize that the parties have to accept the results of negotiation and deal face-to-face with each other. Any settlement, if it's going to be durable, has to be freely accepted by both Israel and the Palestinians. And difficult as it may seem to ask the Palestinians under occupation and who do not yet have an open political process to do so, and I obviously recognize that, they must find a way to convince Israel that a new arrangement ending the occupation is compatible with Israel's legitimate security concerns. The question frequently asked, even by Israelis disposed to territorial compromise, is how can they know that further territorial demands will not follow in years to come? This is not a paper or mechanical question, but a basic matter of human psychology. Israel keeps agreements negotiated freely. It has withdrawn from the Sinai. And it was a big thing. Many people thought that would not happen, and that every step of the way we heard, you know, can't do this, can't do that. When it came to it, I'll finish in just a minute, all these matters went through the Knesset 2-1, those the interim steps in the 70s. And I've been a firm believer that if we could get the negotiating process going, that we could get a result that Israelis would support, as well as Palestinians, and that could change this situation. Many people have doubts. I'll be done in just a minute. The negotiations which we envisage can change the reality of these 21 years. Many people have doubts about the Israeli government's decision. Prime Minister is going to come here next week without a cabinet decision, and he has said he's going to take it back or put it to the government there for a decision after his visit here. We have put forward our ideas clearly. The Palestinians, and I'm not speaking now of next week, but more generally, must show their willingness to participate in the political process. The choice for the Palestinians, and I guess I mean the PLO, is whether to hold out for a maximalist position at some distant future time or to join a process that is at hand. Our proposal is not an easy road to follow, but the alternative is protracted conflict. I want to end by sharing just a few sentences from the statement that the Secretary of State made at the American Colony Hotel on the 26th of February when, as you know, he was hoping to meet with a number of Palestinians. Our vision is of Israelis and Palestinians living together in peace in this land, where the rights of each are respected, where the energies of all are directed at peaceful purposes, where security and trust exist. The time is right together to make decisions of historic importance. Let us translate our dreams into the reality of peace, rights, and security for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch. I would like to announce that we will have a question-answer period at the end of this session, and it will be 30 minutes or longer if need be. I have been told we do have the room for an extra 45 minutes if we need to, because there is no other panels after this one in this room. So if you please be patient. We have another speaker, a distinguished speaker who just came from the West Bank. We have Dr. Nuha Abu Dhabi with us. She's a clinical psychologist. She's practicing, has been practicing since 1967. She has done a lot of work in this field, especially with Palestinians. She has had a lot of publications from 1964 all the way to current 1987, some of which are the role of Palestinian women in the revolution, and some about the group therapies on children. It's my understanding, and I received the word today, that I understand that Dr. Abu Dhabi just came back from the West Bank after an official visit. It wasn't a visit, a personal visit, but a fact-finding mission. And she's going to be talking to us about the psychosocial comment about the uprising based on eyewitness review. Please help me welcome Dr. Nuha Abu Dhabi.
Do I have to put these down? Yeah, I'm the shortest in the whole room. Okay, I guess I should start by saying that I was not alone on this trip. I was accompanied by a very distinguished colleague who happens to be in the room today. And judging by the atmosphere from the room, I assume that a lot of you will have a lot of questions of probably both of us. And I also want to say that I do have some printouts of my talk. I do want to be very stingy with them. I didn't expect this many people, so I have approximately 60 of them, and I'm only willing to give them out to people who will benefit from them, in the sense that this is basically a cry out for some of the medical needs in the area, which are abominable. And I'm sure some of you have already been exposed to it from the visit that the 4 physicians made from the group that's for human rights. And therefore, I do want you to be kind of understanding and not be selfish in getting the printouts. I do want to pass them out, but as I said, very selectively. And at the end of the talk, or at the end of the whole symposium, I would appreciate that people come and let be known to me if they can be of use once they understand what this is all about. I just want to start by commenting that although the uprising was somewhat of a surprise to some people, I am sure some of you are aware that it was not a surprise to everybody. And don't do that, please. It's obvious that the people who have been going to the occupied territories off and on were aware that something was going to be happening. That's one. And two, there are some Israeli sociologists, psychologists who have been predicting this all along. Anybody who's aware of the conditions under which the people in the occupied territories have been living were aware that something was going to happen at some point. To indicate this, I'm going to share with you some of my observations. These observations are based on several things that I have been looking at for the past few years. One of them actually is a visit that I made in 1983. The other one is by working with several Palestinians, especially some who have been imprisoned by Israelis, who obviously are full of a lot of information about the way Israelis utilize several psychological methods in tormenting. I'm also using the latest visit that we have made. As I said, it was a fact-finding mission that was undertaken by a foundation that encompasses several professionals. I'm running out of, I'm going to use this glass. I had pizza for lunch and I'm getting very thirsty, so please excuse me. Now, let me share with you the ways in which I believe that the Israelis have been controlling the Palestinian population in the occupied territories. They have been extremely clever. They have utilized several methods. And one of them, I think, was a continuous psychological warfare that has been going on for the past 20 years. This warfare can be observed to be made in several methods. One obvious method was basically geared towards the middle class. And what they did is that they somehow made the middle class Palestinian feel as though they had some measure of comfort living under occupation. And what happened is that when that specific Palestinian acted out by not doing exactly what the Israelis expected of him or her, they were, as you know, over the years we have heard about people that were deported. So if you're a good boy, you will be okay. If you're not, you are immediately punished very severely, which is excellent consequencing, and it's a very good way for them to get rid of an unwanted population. Now, the other method that they have done with people who stayed on, it's very interesting how they created situations where people seem to be on almost a leash of give and take, give and take. And if any of you, I'm sure all of you can identify with that, have lived under any kind of circumstances where you never know how your behavior is going to be consequenced, you will definitely be a very, very anxious person. I'm sure every one of you in this room may have passed through a stage like that sometime in their lives. We're talking about a whole population that's being treated in that manner. For example, I won't name names because I don't want to give away significant names, but a very prominent attorney who was supposed to come to the United States to speak with some officials, he did not know that he was going to be given a permit until 1:30 of the morning that he was departing, which means that he had only 2 hours to prepare to leave. But all along, for at least weeks, he had been said yes and no, yes and no. This may seem so unimportant, but I think some of us would be appreciative of what a tough situation that is to be in. And this is only one little example of how that is done to one specific person. There were other instances where, for example, another very clever technique, which I wasn't aware of, is, for example, lately a group of Palestinian artists came here from the occupied territories. As it turns out, although a large number of them were invited, they were not all able to make the trip. Why was that? Because some of them were denied an exit visa. And when you start analyzing the data as to why they were not given an exit visa, you would assume that because they were politically active or they had some other reasons. It turns out that they are very inconsistent in making the rejection visa, which means they stir up a lot of suspicion among the Palestinians themselves, wondering, now, why was he given? Why was the other one not given? If you understand what I'm saying, this is a very subtle method of creating divisiveness among the people, or attempting to. If people don't have a political consciousness, then they would start mistrusting each other, wondering, now he must have collaborated with the Israelis or whatever. Those kind of feelings are stirred up among the people by doing something very systematically clever, which is deny or give a visa at their own whim as they wished. And I don't think it was just a whimsical event. I think it was intentionally created in order to create this kind of an atmosphere. These are just what I call psychological warfare. The other very, I think, harmful thing that was done, and these are, by the way, explanations of why things have been brewing up among everybody. Another situation is that of continuously humiliating the Palestinians. For example, there would be a car passing by, the whole family is in the car, the father, the mother, the children. The Israeli authorities stop the car. The father is asked to get out of the car, and he is put through some of the ugliest forms of humiliation. Put your hand up, stick your leg out, etc. Just humiliating him, knowing that that will have a severe impact on the rest of the family. As you know, the father is supposed to be the protector, the head of the household. If he's diminished in size, that reflects on the whole family. The whole family is put to shame. The father looks very helpless, because obviously he doesn't have much of a choice. The other choice is to be verbally abusive, to fight back. What does that mean? Imprisonment, or being beat up, or whatever. He has no power. He is powerless, and that's proven over and over again in many encounters in front of the rest of the family. I think that has had a tremendous impact. Need more water. Taking your water. As I said, this is a significant point, by the way, because these are the same kids that we have seen the past 3 months throwing stones. These are the children who have seen their parents humiliated. This is one aspect of the outcome of the visible humiliation that the child experienced and was unable to continue with or to tolerate over the years. At some point, he had to rebel for his father or his mother, I believe. The other way that these humiliations were done, another example, I think examples are usually very helpful in visualizing something. Many times, a lot of people who have really enjoyed a certain status in their society, among their family, suddenly find themselves in a very demoralizing and dehumanizing kind of situations, for example, when they cross the bridge. For us, we don't know these things. These things happen every day there. They've been happening for 20 years. They didn't happen just the last 3 months. A person who has a certain status in the city, he's crossing the border to visit his family in Amman, for example. They many times have to take off their shoes, etc. Their shoes would be piled up in one big pile. And this man, an elderly man, would have to go in there, dig for his shoes among all these shoes. I may be overly sensitive as a psychologist, and I do admit we have our biases, but to me that is a very dehumanizing situation to be in. For someone who has to visit on a continuous basis, to have to go through that process, I do know it does do a lot of damage. I'm building up to the physical damages, but for me as a psychologist, as I said, my bias is that psychological damage is very damaging. I cannot say more than that. The other example that I have is, for example, this is way before the uprising. There were people who told stories of crossing the highway and suddenly, let's say there is a group of stones in front of the car. They are told by settlers who might be standing at the road to get out of the car again. This is a distinguished professor I know of that had taken his degree in the United States. The man is very proud of his education, etc. He is made under gunpoint to get out of his car, move every stone by stone, so that the settlers can pass through. This is before the uprising. I'm, as you see, emphasizing the fact that a lot of atrocities, a lot of awful things have been happening way before, and they've been happening for 20 years in a very consistent way. I have talked about psychological warfare. The next step, I do like to talk about the direct punitive measures that have been taken over the 20 years. The direct punitive measures are such things as, for example, I don't know how many of you are aware that about 70% of the population in the occupied territories has been in prison. They have been jailed in one way or another. That is a very high percentage. These include many times people as young as 8 years old. Well, I was told about an 8-year-old when I visited this time in the Gaza Strip. Initially, it's very clever. The Israelis had put the young people with the old people. In our standards, by the way, we think that's atrocious. We should not put older prisoners with younger prisoners. But apparently, among the Palestinian community, this was a plus. Because what happened is that the older men were able to teach the younger men to become more politicized. And they did a good job. Unfortunately, the Israeli authorities woke up to this fact, and they separated them. So what happened, in fact, may be in some ways responsible for this latest uprising. They produced little monsters in some ways, quote unquote, I'm putting it by the way, is that these kids that the Israelis took over and started working on and tormenting and torturing because there weren't all these grown-ups around, are some of the kids that ended up out in the streets throwing the stones. And by the way, there was an anecdote about one young man who had been imprisoned from age 12, had left at age 15, was probably almost the leader of the uprising in one of the camps. He was the product of the Israeli imprisonment. So we are talking about kids that whose behavior we had seen lately because of certain atrocities that have been done upon them. In addition to imprisonment, I'm not, as you see, I'm just glossing over things. This, you can just use your imagination and just think about the 70% of the population being imprisoned at one time or another for many lengths of times. One of the men we encountered, by the way, had been imprisoned for 17 years. And the other method of punitive measurements that were taken, for example, since the occupation, 1,600 persons have been deported. That's a very high number, too. And the other thing that has happened is that 309 homes have been demolished while mass punishments have been done, which means that one person might even be suspect and the whole house is demolished as a retaliation against possible suspicion against one member of the family. And by the way, it's interesting to note, I don't have all the numbers, but apparently the number of houses that were demolished have increased in number as the years went by, which means the occupation has become more and more forceful in its aggression towards the occupied. I call the third method of occupation, or what has led to the uprising, the subtle policies of annihilation. And there are many methods of annihilation that have been used, but I will focus only on one method because this is my specialty and my area, and that is the making sure that very poor medical care is provided for the Palestinians. What we saw in the hospitals, we visited at least 3 hospitals. In fact, in the Gaza Strip, it was abominable. And I hate to say this, but I made the statement. I said, I would not put my cat in one of the hospitals I saw in Gaza. I cannot describe to you how awful the conditions were. And there were many ways in which the Israeli authorities directly participated in making sure that the medical cares were of minimal nature. For example, they did not give permissions for certain specialties to practice there because they had certain rules about certain machines. For example, the whole Gaza area did not have a single pathologist. How could you do good treatment without having a pathologist? Well, they send the samples over to Israeli area, and many times the samples get lost. Now, they don't allow for ambulances with the equipment in them. For what they had for ambulances were basically vehicles like my Volkswagen van, which just transported wounded people from one area to the other. They also imposed a $300 per year premium for medical insurance in order to provide care for them, health care, basic health care we're talking about. I'm not talking about fancy psychoanalysis. I'm talking about basic medical care. A lot of these people do not get. And of course, I don't have to mention, because all of you have seen on television all the broken bones, you've seen all of the atrocities that have been inflicted upon a lot of the young men that we saw. I would be more than happy to answer questions later on because we did see quite a bit. I don't think I have time. Our monitor is telling me to get off. 2 minutes I have. Okay, so just to summarize what I'm saying is that what I'm trying to explain is, one, the occupation has not been a nice one, to say the least, for the past 20 years. It has been waging a very systematic and consistent psychological warfare against the people. It has punished them through many means, among which are imprisonment, banishment, and the destruction of homes, and humiliation. And what we have seen the past 3 months is just the collective pain that these people have been battling in for the past 20 years. And as I say in my paper, it took teenagers to act it out for the whole society. And you know, we all know teenagers are very good at that. It's the teenagers that were out of the streets and acted out for the parents. And as far as I'm concerned, they were really, I think this was their expression of love for their parents, whom they saw humiliated in front of them for the past 20 years. They had had enough. They had to express it all. And I think the parents picked up after that. That's why we see it continuing on. Because it's my impression that kids cannot sustain a certain behavior over too long a period. But the parents caught up with the enthusiasm and were able to take it and continue with it. And you should see, I should be depressed after this trip, but I'm not. I did feel very good because I saw something in some ways that was very beautiful. I saw a lot of cohesiveness, and I saw a solidarity that was simply beautiful. Everybody in the streets was talking about nothing but the uprising. There was a very interesting air in the whole atmosphere.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. Can we have a little silence, please? We're going to continue now with the question-answer period. I would like, before we start with the question-answer, to say a few things. Number one, I would refuse to let anyone make a speech standing there, because I would like to give the opportunity for each and everyone that's standing in line to ask a question. If you have more than one question, I would suggest maybe you want to hold off to the second or the third question until several of the individuals standing in line get the chance to ask their first question. When you ask the question, may I ask that you state your name first? You would indicate to whom you're addressing your question, and then you will proceed with the question. I guess since I'm standing here, if you give me the chance and allow me to ask the first question to Mr. John Hirsch from the State Department. Mr. Hirsch, you have indicated during your speech about several remarks made by several Secretary of States and several individuals and various administrations dating back to 1967 about the recognition of the Palestinians. How would you answer the recent remarks that I have read of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger when he was addressing a Jewish group during a breakfast, and he said, quote unquote, "We should let the Israelis boot the media and shoot the Arabs"?
Yeah, well, I'm very distressed by those remarks, and I certainly don't share those views.
Am I to say that Henry Kissinger is a spokesman for the administration or not when he indicates that?
What was the answer?
He doesn't agree with him, and that's it. Okay, well, I'll let the rest of you take the chance to ask your question and answer. Please, we will not allow speeches or comments. Ask a question, and I appreciate your complying with this.
My name is Joseph McLouf, and I have a question for Mr. Hirsch. In your opinion, was there any preferential treatment to Israel by the United States government as a whole, and injustices toward the Palestinians? And if so, would you do whatever you can in your power to balance that in the future and offset it by preferential treatment to the other party?
Thank you, John. Mr. Hirsch.
I'm going to try to give you short answers. Our basic approach to the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians is to get a political process going. That is the answer to this entire problem. We obviously have a close relationship with Israel. We also, and I won't go and develop it all for you because you're aware of it, we have been trying to develop various programs for the Palestinians, but the key point is to end the occupation. You can't make an occupation into a good occupation. You can only end it.
Sorry, was there or wasn't there injustices and preferential treatment, please? And in your opinion, would you, as a person, try to, all in your power, to offset that? Please.
Well, I don't really conceive the whole situation in those terms. I just can't answer your question in those terms. And I've tried to give you the answer that I think is the correct answer.
Thank you. In that case, I have another question to Nuha, since my question was not answered. Were you experiencing...
Joseph.
Did you experience any...
Who are you addressing your question to, and could you please make it fast?
Nuha Abu Dibbe, please. Dr. Nuha. Did you experience any side effect of the American-made tear bombs that were made in the United States in 1988? Tear gas and tear bombs.
We did experience it once when we were in the Old City on Friday, just the day before Schultz came there. And I think the Israelis were worried about the law of trouble, so they had shot a tear gas into one of the homes in the Old City. And in fact, my colleague, who's again in the audience here, and maybe she should come up, she in fact indicated to me she was about to choke. She started choking. And that was the day when we rescued one of the young men, actually, from the Israeli soldiers. We gathered a group of tourists and we went for them. We would not let them beat up the kid. We were able to rescue one kid. Thank you.
Your question, please.
My name is Nadim Haddad, and I have a question for Mr. Hirsch also.
Could you please speak louder? They can't hear you in the background.
I have a question for Mr. Hirsch. Mr. Hirsch, since you are from the State Department and you have placed so much emphasis on Resolution 242 as a precondition to talk to the PLO, can you please tell us what the official State Department interpretation of 242's statement, withdrawal of Israeli troops from territories occupied? What does territories mean? Does it include all territories? Does it include Jerusalem? What's the interpretation?
Thank you. Mr. Hirsch.
If I can first just say something about tear gas and all the other beatings and other events that have gone on, none of us condone tear gas. I'm talking about my colleagues, talking about the Secretary of State. And none of us condone the beatings, and none of us condone the use of lethal force. And we have taken up these issues with the Israelis. But the point I made to you, and I think to some extent, and I would never overstate it to you, I think if anybody has an influence to attenuate some of this, it's the United States government. But the answer is the political process. 242 applies ever since 1967 on all fronts. That means the Sinai, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. And we have said, it was said at exchange of letters at the time of Camp David Accords. It was also said by Arthur Goldberg back in 1967 that the final status of Jerusalem is unresolved and has to be settled in negotiations. There's been absolutely no change in any American position throughout all the administrations. And it's not the State Department, it is the United States government.
Mr. Hurst, you...
Could you state your name, please?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Husseini.
Oh.
You spoke about sorrow in your talk and talked about a constructive American policy. On the issue of sending American weapons to Israel to be used against the civilians, the tear gas, the rubber bullets, the live ammunition, I'm not a legal expert, but I think this is against American law because American weapons given to Israel should be used in case of war and self-defense, and I think you know very well that as long as Israel uses them against innocent, unarmed civilians, this is against American law and international law. So if you are, or your Secretary of State is sorry and you want to be constructive, why don't you cut off these weapons and tell Israel that it's not going to receive tear gas and rubber bullets? And this rubber bullet, by the way, a friend gave it to me. It's from the West Bank. It's made in North Carolina. The tear gas is made in Pennsylvania, labeled 1988. Some of it was fired, by the way, inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Sheikh of the mosque sent that tear gas canister to your consul, American consul, with a letter. Now, I heard your answer when American weapons were mentioned, and you said, well, it's
excuse
a political...
me, Dr. Hassan. Can you allow him to answer the first? Let him answer.
Let me finish it. Let me finish it. Right? He implied as if it is something to blackmail the Palestinians until they accept a certain political position which the U.S. wants. And I want to mention one last thing. In the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, the United States was on record that it will protect innocent civilians, and these papers were torn, and Israel committed an act of genocide in massacring Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila. And now for the fourth month, Israel is using American-made weapons against innocent civilians, which to my mind is an act of genocide, and the U.S. is an accomplice to it, and therefore I want his view. I know he's not going to answer me, but I want his view about this.
Could we please, thank you, Dr. Hassan.
The President, the Secretary, and everybody who works in the administration is certainly not in favor of genocide, is certainly not in favor of or even thinks in the terms of blackmailing anybody. These are simply not true. The United States does not, well, either I talk or you talk, I don't know. The United States support for Israel, which includes military assistance and economic assistance, is approved by the United States Congress. Those weapons are not sent against the Palestinian people. Absolutely not. Israel is a sovereign country. The United States cannot control every action of the government of Israel. We have spent, that is simply a fact. You can all agree or disagree, but it is a fact. We have spent a great deal of time with the Minister of Defense trying to get this entire situation ended. We do not support the use of lethal force or beatings or tear gas or any of these methods. So that is, well, and well,
excuse me, can we have quiet in the back, please, or we have to ask you to leave the room? I hate to do that, but we cannot have this shouting. Quiet. Dr. Did you finish your... Yes, go ahead with the next question, please.
It's good to have you, Mr. Hirsch. You can do a lot of pressure on Israel by, just pulling the plug of the $4 billion of our hard-earned tax dollars. They will change their policy first thing tomorrow morning. My question is, the relationship between Israel and the United States is a textbook example of the tail wagging the dog. That is Israel wagging the United States when it comes to Middle East foreign policy. And since the United States' position on not speaking and recognizing the PLO, unless the PLO, which is the victim, the rapee, that has to recognize Israel, which is the rapist in that situation, was orchestrated by John Kissinger, who is, a Jewish American, and I would suspect he had a conflict of interest when he was Secretary of State and issued that major decision that committed the United States to that. And his recent...
Could you please state the question?
I'm almost finished.
We have a lot of people that...
His recent racist statements tells that he is not American as much as he is a Zionist. Why would our country commit itself to this ill-conceived policy of not recognizing the PLO, which is the legitimate representative of all Palestinian peoples? Everybody's holding Yasser Arafat pictures back home.
I've already explained the policy which has been the policy of the United States government, not of any single individual, for a long time. There have been many, many Arab leaders and many Palestinians who think the PLO should take what really, to me, do not seem, on their merits, very difficult steps at all. The two resolutions were accepted by all the members of the Security Council and are accepted by virtually every country in the Arab world. I just don't see any reason why the PLO cannot accept those resolutions. Similarly, I answered you on that earlier. Well, do I talk or do you talk? I mean, I can go home and you can address the questions and, I'll answer you, but if you give me a chance to talk. Similarly, the Arab states that have sought peace with Israel have accepted Israel's right to exist. That is just not a very complicated matter for me, and I don't see why it is so difficult for the PLO to do this. And in fact, I believe that the PLO would gain very greatly for itself, and above all for the Palestinian people, because what you're really concerned about, I assume, are the Palestinian people, by just taking this step. But I said unequivocally, because the problem, and I also told you that no Arab representative has ever come to the United States government and said this has happened. None. Neither Clovis Maqsood nor anybody else has ever said it's happened, because they know it has not happened. So, that's my answer.
Go ahead, please.
My name is Catherine Wilford. My question is for Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen, on January 19th, Defense Minister Rabin called for a policy of might, power, and beatings. The most recent United Jewish Appeal Fund Drive, which ended after Rabin's statement, produced a higher total than last year's fund drive. How do you account for this if the American Jewish community is truly reevaluating its support of Israeli policy?
Thank you. Mr. Cohen?
Well, I'm tempted to say that it's the seesaw effect that I was addressing before, but it doesn't fully answer your question. That to me is a troubling fact. It's one that I haven't seen the books of the UJA, so I don't know if it's accurate or not. If I were the UJA, I would certainly want to say that's the case. I should tell you something about fundraising for Israel that I know about. My brother used to work for Israel Bonds. One of the things that he told me about the capacity to sell Israel bonds in the American Jewish community was that it didn't reflect so much on the attitude of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as it did on various other aspects of the political culture of the Israeli regime. I can't tell you whether, in that particular case, it was a particular affinity that wealthy American Jews felt for the Begin government, more conservative than the Labor government, than it had for the previous governments, which it saw as social democratic and therefore undesirable as a place to invest money. I can't tell you what the real facts are on the fundraising for Israel right now. I think, though, that it's pretty evident, based upon all the things that I mentioned, based upon the pressure that is, or at least the encouragement that's been forthcoming on the administration to change American policy, that there is a serious reevaluation going on in the American Jewish community. It may well be that you can see some differences among different groups in the American Jewish community, and that wealthier people may be kicking in more money than others. But I think that the evidence is pretty compelling that American Jews are reevaluating their attitudes, not toward their commitment to Israel as a concept, but toward the policies that are being pursued by the Shamir government.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
My name is Beth Kutab, and I live in Jerusalem. I want to thank Nuha for her concern about the emotional welfare of Palestinians, particularly what is happening in repercussions of the uprising. For the first time last year, the Palestinians had a mental health conference of professionals in Gaza and Israel and West Bank on this very subject. And if there's anybody in the audience or you personally know of any way that Arab Americans who are trained in this can help us by coming for long-term or any ideas on paraprofessional use, we would be most interested. That's number one. Secondly, I couldn't help but notice the omission in the title of today's panel. It says Implications of the West Bank Uprising. For the sake of the Gazans, this is a frequent omission, and I'm sure it was an oversight, but I just have to mention that the Gazans are very much involved in this uprising. Last but not least...
Let me state on behalf of the ADC, if there was, I don't think there was any implying that we forgot Gaza. We will never forget all the occupied territories, and let me mention the Golan Heights to include that.
Last but not least, very briefly, I wanted to ask Dr. Hirsch if people at the State Department are monitoring the cutoff of electricity that has been taking place by the Army in some refugee camps and villages. I personally am very afraid that the context is being set for another Sabra in Shatila. During the latest curfew in Jelazon refugee camp, for example, the Army broke the lock on the electric company box, which is owned by the Jerusalem Electric Company, and they have since put their own lock on and effectively control the electricity supply for the whole camp. During the curfew, they were turning it off every night from 5 o'clock to 12. This is taking place in other areas as well, and with the increased involvement of settlers and violence by settlers in these areas, it's a critical concern, and I'm wondering if the State Department is monitoring this. And on the tear gas issue, and this is my final, yeah.
Can you let him answer the first question?
Surely.
Okay, you have to allow, there is a long line, and I have to allow a question for each speaker, please.
Surely. I just want the audience to know that Ambassador Pickering several weeks ago assured a group of Americans, we went to visit him, and he assured us that that the U.S. government does support the sending of tear gas, U.S.-made tear gas, to the Israeli government for use by the army. I would like to know if the State Department knows how come it's getting there so fast, because I have seen tear gas made in Salzburg, Pennsylvania, dated January '88, manufacture date, and we have documentation that it was used the third week in Gaza against people, and I would like to know how come it's getting there so fast.
Yeah, I don't have any information for you on delivery. So far as what's going on, and I want to repeat what I said to you before, that the United States does not support or condone the use of tear gas against civilians in these situations. So far as what's going on in the camps, our Consulate General in Jerusalem is giving us reports, and I would welcome any additional information you could give us, and if you send it to me, that would be very helpful. Yeah, send it to me.
Go ahead, please.
My name is Nabil Abraham.
Excuse me, let me interrupt. May I say that you have as much right to ask your question, and our guest speakers, we have to allow them the right to answer. So please, if I may ask that you don't interrupt any of the answers until the speaker is finished, and then you have the right to ask whatever question you want. Continue, please.
Yeah, my question is directed to both Mr. Quant and Mr. Hirsch. Mr. Quant spoke of American interests in the Middle East, and I was wondering if he could elaborate on those and how they're threatened by the Palestinian uprising. And Mr. Hirsch spoke of, in this peace process, of sharing the land. Does the United States government currently support the idea of sovereignty for the Palestinian people, as it supports the sovereignty, as you've mentioned several times, of Israel? In other words, the independence of a people to live in its own land, not autonomy. You know the difference very well, I'm sure. So,
thank you.
Let me just deal with the question of interests as I interpret them, and I tried to lay stress not so much on the fact that the uprising per se is threatening interests. In fact, it may be opening a whole new chapter that ultimately will lead to a much more positive outcome. But the concern, as I see it, and this is subjective, from the American standpoint, is with the kind of radicalizing potential that this has. We do not have particularly good relations as a country with Khomeini, Gaddafi-style regimes. Now, there is a concern that if regimes who have traditionally been identified with the United States feel that they have to take their distance from us because of our stand on this issue, or that they're being undermined by their own passivity in the face of the uprising. After all, most of the regimes look rather pathetic. They're not doing anything other than hoping that their own people will not get ideas and start demanding change also. So there is a concern that the kind of relatively stable Middle East order in which American interests have prospered rather well will come tumbling down one day. And the second point I made is that at some point, if this conflict goes on and we remain entirely identified with the Israelis in the minds of most Arabs, the Soviets will inevitably emerge as the champion of the Palestinian cause. And that will bring the U.S.-Soviet rivalry right into the heart of this conflict. And that's ultimately not good for American interests. Our interests lie in the Arab world as well as with Israel. And unless we are in a position to have credibility in the Arab world as fair-minded with a policy based on a genuine commitment to peace and justice, I don't think we can have good relations with the Arab world over the long term. And that's why I say unless the uprising can be channeled into a peaceful settlement soon, if it just leads to further deepening of the hatreds, expanding violence, Israeli oppression, I think the United States is going to find its already rather weak position in the region further weakened. And that's why I think strictly from a standpoint not of humanitarian concern or morality, which alas is a luxury in international affairs, but from a standpoint of straightforward American national interests, we have to be engaged on the side of peace with justice on this conflict. Thank you.
What's called autonomy, Palestinian self-government, was envisaged already 8 years ago as an interim step. If it would have happened in 1981, we'd already be beyond it now. It is still envisaged in the initiative that Bill Quant described to you as an interim step, with the idea of moving quickly to what are called so-called final status negotiations. In those negotiations, our views were spelled out already in 1982 in President Reagan's plan. That is, we believe that the best or most viable option would be an association of the West Bank with Jordan. Every party who goes to those negotiations, if we can ever get them going, should and will be able to put his views forward on the table. The point today is to get to the table.
My question is to Mr. Hirsch, and it's concerned with moving the question of peace process. And it is in two parts. The part A is regarding the withholding recognition of the PLO, and is it practical to have the continuous State Department position under the pretense of renouncing terrorism, withholding the recognition of the PLO, considering that the rest of the international community, 104 nations, recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and also the fact that the uprising today is telling us that the PLO is the representative of the Palestinian people. Then, is it practical, and will we move the peace process forward as we continue to ignore the fact that the PLO is the representative of the Palestinian people? It's not just a so-called terrorist organization. It also has labor unions, it has student unions, it has women, it has all these Palestinian institutions under the umbrella. Will we continue to ignore that? That's part A. Part B is regarding pressuring Israel to have them come out to a compromising position. Now, I noticed the beautiful orchestration of the Noriega pressure as to how they are bringing him to his knees. When will the United States government bring Shamir, who is a terrorist, to his knees? I want you to do that. When will that happen? They are killing our people daily with live ammunition. They are killing our people daily with live ammunition. They are burying our children alive. They are imprisoning our children and our women. And you tell me you denounce this, but what are you going to do about it? And when?
Thank you. Mr. Hirsch.
The Secretary's initiative is what we are doing about it. This, as I said in my remarks to you, is an opportunity. That is what we're doing about it. So far as the United States position on the PLO, it is not the position of the Department of State as some little compartmentalized entity down on 21st Street. It is the position of the United States government and the United States Congress, of your representatives. It has been United States policy of Democratic administrations. It has been United States policy of Republican administrations. All of you have representatives. There's an election in this country this year. You want to change that policy of the United States Congress and of the next administration, that's what you should do. I also said that I did not find it, and I just do not find it, so difficult for the PLO to take these steps. I think it's in the interest of the Palestinian people that the PLO does so. I just find it incomprehensible that they don't do so. And I think that many of the Arab leaders would echo that also. So far as pressure, I spoke to that in my remarks, and I know that we can go through a lot of comparisons here with Noriega and this one and that one. In my view of international relations, every situation is unique. In my view, the way for there to be negotiations is the one I described, and I believe that to use sanctions or whatever other of 101 proposals I've heard over the 15 years would lead to some sort of result, but I'm not convinced that it would bring about the result that you want and that I want, which is to end this conflict.
Okay, my name is Karima Benon, and I have a question for Mr. Hirsch. Sorry.
I think you might as well stand up. Could we have about approximately
It's
10
very
people
brief.
behind.
It's
Please,
very brief.
Please, so we can have...
What I would like you to do for me, please, is to define terrorism, because renouncing terrorism is the condition you have for dealing with the PLO, and I would like to understand how you define terrorism.
Thank you.
The Congress and the executive have defined terrorism, and terrorism is a scourge, and I don't think any of us have difficulty in knowing what it is. And I know what you're getting at. The United States has not defined... No. Anyway, that's my answer.
Shouldn't expect it better.
Can we have the... Would you ask your question?
Yes, my name is Omar Jabara. First of all, Mr. Hirsch, I'd like to address my question to him, and I'd like to welcome him to ADC 1988. Mr. Hirsch, I have a little preamble, and then I'm going to ask a question, but it's a short preamble. Considering the war crimes of the United States and the evil it has poured on the blacks, the Indians, the Nicaraguans, the people of South Africa, the people of Southeast Asia, considering that the United States vetoes anything in the UN that has to do with slamming Israel, considering how much the United States allowed Israel to get away with over the years, such as with using phosphorus bombs in Lebanon, and Sabra and Shatila, and you know the whole spiel, I'm not going to go through it. American tear gas and guns going to Israel.
Could you please state the question?
Yeah, I will, right now. And also supporting terrorists like Pinochet, he's a terrorist, if I ever saw one. Do you think that the Palestinian people should trust this George Shultz so-called peace initiative, considering all of this here?
Thanks.
Well, without going through all the preamble, many of your question, many Palestinians have welcomed the initiative of the Secretary of State, and I think that they who are living there and going through this have recognized that this is a very genuine and positive effort on the part of the Secretary of State. Several representatives of the Palestinians were in Washington last month. They emerged, Hana Sinyor and Fayez Abu Rahme, they emerged from the meeting and they welcomed the initiative of the Secretary. In the meeting that the Secretary had with the NAAA and the ADC, which is the host of this event, and they released a press release afterward, they welcomed the initiative. If any of these people don't want that initiative, the ones I've just mentioned to you, they should say so. I don't know of any other initiative that's out there, and what I have tried to put across to you today, and I really understand your passions and feelings, and I'm not surprised by anything you say, and I share many and most of these concerns. The issue I've tried to address is how we go ahead. We can vent our strong convictions all night here, but the issue is how to get into negotiations, and I have suggested to you what we think is a way to proceed, and I've also said to you that nobody else in the entire world that I know of has come up with an alternative. So sort of going full blast against the Secretary's efforts, which is certainly legitimate in our country, I'm not sure will really help the people who are under this occupation. I urge you to think about that, please, as you go home tonight.
Go ahead, please.
My name is Nina Colors, and I want to give Mr. Hirsch a break and address myself to Mr. Cohen. In our efforts to uphold peace, we often sidestep the importance of justice. To me, peace is an end, and justice is the means to that end. The PLO's tactics of dealing with the facing of the are not acceptable. What are some nonviolent means that you would recommend that would combat the atrocities and the demoralizing humiliation that the Palestinians are facing, that Dr. Abu Dube mentioned about?
Thank you.
I think that what's happening in the territories with the young people has done more in the world's mind to advance the cause of Palestinian people and Palestinian nationalism than many of the acts that have taken place over the years that have, I think, been intended as efforts to keep in front of the world the cause of the Palestinians, but in fact the way they have been received have probably retarded the receptivity of many people in the world to the Palestinian cause. The kind of mass uprising, I'm not saying that Palestinians should be nonviolent in the face of violence. I think that nonviolence is a wonderful thing if it's effective, and I don't think anybody is obliged to be nonviolent in the face of being physically assaulted. On the other hand, I think that the kind of mass uprising that's occurred in the territories has been much more effective in advancing the Palestinian cause than, for instance, the attack on the bus near Dimona. That's the sort of activity that tends to suggest to people that perhaps these people aren't a group that we can really talk with, that their intent is not really to create a Palestinian state but in the West Bank and Gaza, but maybe to attack the underlying essence of Israel. Whatever the case may be, I think that the uprising has done much more to further the cause of Palestinian nationalism than do episodic acts of anti-civilian violence. And I think that most of us recognize that, and certainly has turned around much of American opinion.
I'm going to allow only one more question, and I'm sorry and I apologize that we do have to close. We're going to allow the people to go and change or whatever they'd like to do before dinner, because my understanding is they would like to start dinner on time. So I am sorry, my apologies, but go ahead with one last question.
We'll make it quick. Just cut it out. We'll make it quick. We've been standing here for an hour.
Huh?
We'll make it quick. My question is just 1 second. I'm going to bypass everybody.
Please.
I'll be a good boy. Mr.
Just a minute. Excuse me. Let me indicate this. I am sure our guest speakers would be more than happy to discuss a question after we finish, if you'd like to come forward. So please, Hamza, if you'd go ahead with your question.
Okay.
Would you please let him answer the question? We're wasting too much time there. Please let him ask his question. Go ahead, Hamza. We have 5 people ahead of you. Please ask your question.
Okay. My name is Hamza Moghrabi from Denver. The PLO is asked to recognize the right of Israel to exist. The Jewish liberal organizations, whenever they start a dialogue or do something, they ask the participants to recognize the legitimacy of Israel. I'd like to hear Mr. Cohen, Mr. Hirsch, and Mr. Quant to define what Israel is, bearing in mind that Israel is the only state in the world that does not have a constitution, that does not have boundaries, that the law of return and the law of naturalization allows only children born from a Jewish mother to be citizens of Israel, while other Jews have to prove their Jewishness to become Israelis. And the Israeli Palestinians...
Could you please, could you please state your question? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to state your question.
And the Israeli Palestinians were given naturalization in 1965 by residency and not by birth. So can the three of you define what Israel is? Because it looks to be very ambiguous to recognize something that is so evasive to hold.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Cohen, you want to take?
Well, there's good reason why it's hard to define, because the borders are, and there aren't accepted borders right now among any of the parties concerned. Hopefully that through a process of negotiation, that's the sort of thing that will be resolved. My personal preference would be that they be resolved somewhere around the pre-1967 borders, and that Israel be contained within those pre-67 borders or thereabouts, and that there be a Palestinian state created in the West Bank and Gaza. That's my particular preference. Regarding your other questions, these are a litany of things that I basically in agreement with you about. And I don't know really how to answer them. I think that I would favor an increasing democratization of Israeli society, increasing pluralism, and that non-discrimination be a fundamental precept of that society. I should also say that the organization I work with, the Jewish Committee for Israeli-Palestinian Peace, has not made it a precondition to working in relationship with other groups that they first accept Israel's right to exist. I would certainly encourage that for any number of reasons, but that has not been a precondition for our particular group to work with other groups.
Thank you. Mr. John Hurd just informed me he will be willing to answer any questions that you might have privately after, so we can allow the rest of the people who would like to go to their rooms, change, shower, and go to dinner, go ahead and do that.
But I like the definition of Mr. Hirsch and Mr. Kwan on